All right. We do still have people coming in, but I am going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. So I will turn my own video off. All right. Now, can everyone see the slide okay? You should see historic homes of Hudson Avenue. It's like a picture with some words on it. All right, great. All right, well, if you don't know who I am, my name is Cory Stutes. I am the museum curator at The Works, and I spend my time with history programming, history exhibits, doing all kinds of stuff geared toward local history. I've worked in local history for my career for the last several years, started working in local history back in college. So it's always been a long-term passion of mine, and really interested in the history of Hudson Avenue. So as a museum, we focus a lot on industry, manufacturing, and the history of Hudson Avenue is sort of tied into that because a lot of the people who ran some of these companies and these factories that we have exhibits for, they lived on Hudson Avenue. So it's a really interesting perspective to take with that. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first slide that you're looking at is a map of Newark, and you can see the date 1866. And this comes from, oh, someone says they see a blank screen. Can everybody see this first map? That says 1866. Okay, all right. All right, awesome. Stacy, someone should be reaching out to you about that. All right, so I know that there's a lot going on in this map. This is from an atlas of not just Licking County, or not just Newark, but of Licking County as well. So you can kind of see if you look, and I should actually, should be able to draw you a picture here. Here is Hudson Avenue. You can see where I just highlighted with that red. Over there towards the right-hand side. There's really not a whole lot going on, especially compared to how things are now. You can see there's a lot of just kind of open space. And Hudson Avenue dead ends. If you really pay attention, you can see St. Clair Street, and Hudson Avenue just kind of stops there. So I wanted to give you this kind of perspective just to think about how it's changed. This was back in 1866. The first house I want to talk about, we can't really talk about the history of Hudson Avenue or the history of Newark for that matter without talking about this house and another one. You might recognize this house. This is the Sherwood Davidson house. It's now home to the Licking County Historical Society. They have a museum set up in there. This is thought to be one of the oldest houses, or if not the oldest, close to the oldest house in Newark. We don't know exactly when it was built, but there's a time frame between 1815 to 1825. So if it was closer to that 1815 date, it would be maybe the second oldest house in Newark. Closer to 1825, there are some, it'd still be one of the oldest houses in Newark. Originally, it was located on the corner of 3rd Street and West Church Street. It might be East Church Street at that point. I'm not exactly sure where it changes. So why would we include this in Hudson Avenue? Well, Hudson Avenue and 3rd Street are essentially one and the same. And years and years ago, it was just referred to as 3rd Street rather than Hudson Avenue. And if you think about it now, it's really easy to kind of separate those into two streets because of 16. It creates a boundary. But if you took 16 away, it's really just one continuous road. So a lot of the things that are in this presentation you'll notice kind of extend more into the downtown area than what we would generally think of as Hudson Avenue, but they are historically all one and the same. So this is the Sherwood Davidson house. I just want to kind of always start off with this. It was moved in the 1940s, and I know this is somewhat of a blurry picture, but here you go. It was lived in by the same family for, I think, around 150 years. and had kind of gone into a state of dereliction. It was located on the corner where Park National Bank is now, and next to just a couple doors down from Carroll's department store. That land had been purchased by the Lazarus Company, and the house was actually going to be torn down, but the newly formed Historical Society was given the house by Fred Lazarus himself. And so it was moved to where it currently is in Veterans Park on 6th Street in downtown Newark. Here's a picture of it today, looking very nice. It's got some really great architecture. It's an example of federal style, and it's a really, really wonderful example of that. That side sort of porch and balcony is really nice, and then there's some wonderful details on the front door. Another house I want to talk about, which was just on the other side of Carroll's department store, is the Buckingham House. Again, this one is owned by the Licking County Historical Society. They operate the Buckingham Meeting House, which is where they have their office and museum, or their office and their library, and you can have events and stuff there. This house was built in 1835, and while it wasn't built by Jerome Buckingham, it's most closely associated with him. He was a local judge. He was also a pretty important man. He was on the board of a bank, involved in a lot of different things. Some guests of this house are said to include presidents. Just a very, very important house. You'll notice it's what's called Greek Revival style, which was very indicative of the 1840s and 1850s throughout Licking County, and especially in Newark. And so you'll notice there are those 4 columns on the front. It's got the pediment. It's just very, very classic Greek Revival style. So I want you to pay attention to that style as we progress later into the presentation, because you'll notice some similarities with some other things. This house also was moved. Here I have a picture of it moving down the street. So it just came out. If you look towards the right side of the picture, you'll see Carroll's department store. And you can see a bunch of like wood and boards and that kind of stuff. And that's where the house came out of. They moved it from there where it had originally been built. When they moved it, they actually had to cut it. So they cut it kind of in half to fit it on the truck. And then they moved it to where it currently is now. Here's a picture of it in Veterans Park. It sits next to the Sherwood Davidson house now. So those 2 houses sort of were the beginning of Hudson Avenue. What now obviously we think of as 3rd Street, but in that part it was still all one street, like I said earlier. Now this house might look like the Buckingham House, but as I said, I wanted you to pay attention to the style because it's in that same Greek Revival style. You'll notice a lot of similarities between the Buckingham House and this house. This is, we kind of refer to it as the Dr. Cooper House, and it was built around the same time as the Buckingham House, built sometime in the 1830s. It's when we really kind of started to see Greek Revival architecture gain a lot of popularity and start to be built in this area. Some really, really great examples of other Greek Revival architecture in Licking County include the Robbins Hunter Museum, which is in the Avery Downer House, or St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Granville. Those are both contemporaries of this building and of the Buckingham House, and built in a Greek Revival style as well. So this Dr. Cooper House is located on Hudson Avenue and Wyoming Street on the corner. And it's sort of the beginning of what we now kind of think of as the beginning of Hudson Avenue. So you'll notice that there are the columns on the front and the pediment and all of those types of things that are indicative of Greek Revival architecture. Here's a picture of what it looks like today. Actually, it looks a little bit better than this today. This is a screenshot from Google Maps, and so I think this says it was taken in 2018. Someone recently bought it within the last year or so, and they have been painting it and cleaning it up. So it looks a little bit more brighter colors than this, like they painted the roof and stuff. So it's looking pretty good. And a very interesting thing about this house, though, I mentioned it was built in the 1830s. In the 1840s, something happened that was not so dissimilar to things that we're experiencing today. If anyone is familiar, there was actually a pretty terrible cholera outbreak in the late 1840s, I think around 1848. And in Newark, it hit pretty hard. They didn't really understand at that time why cholera was spread, or they had a very basic understanding of it. But what was happening, someone had noticed in a house in South 5th Street near the canal, which is about where the library is now, somewhere in that area, maybe the back parking lot of the library. Someone had noticed that there were a bunch of people sick. There were workers that had been staying in that house. It was being used as a boarding house. And someone had noticed that people were sick. They had been having a bunch of people die week after week. People were dying. And they noticed that these people were starting to have convulsions. And that's when they realized that it was likely cholera. And cholera spreads through contaminated water. So back then, having clean water was already an issue. So if you add cholera into the mix, it gets pretty deadly. This was not just an outbreak that was in Newark alone. It was happening all over the country. So there were people everywhere in the United States that were dealing with a cholera outbreak. But in Newark, it started to hit and it spread pretty violently. A lot of people who were able to, they got out of the city. They went to surrounding areas and tried to get away if they could. This included a lot of the doctors, which is pretty, if you have an outbreak of disease, you want doctors to be able to take care of people. One doctor who didn't leave, though, was Dr. Cooper, and that was the man who lived in this house. And he had a family, he had daughters and a wife, and they all lived there. He decided that he was going to stay back and stay in Newark rather than flee, because he understood that these people needed taken care of. So more and more people continued to die, and unfortunately, Dr. Cooper himself came down with cholera. His entire family ended up getting it. They had a young woman that they employed that helped them with some housework. She got it, and I believe all of them died except for a daughter. I think one of his daughters did survive, but unfortunately everybody else died. And an interesting thing is that a lot of the people who died during that cholera outbreak were buried in the old city cemetery, which was on 6th Street, which is now Veterans Park. So when they moved those graves to Cedar Hill Cemetery, a lot of the ones that didn't have people claiming them were people who had died in the cholera outbreak, whose family members had also died. Hence, one of the reasons why they didn't have anyone to come and take their body to the new cemetery. This next house I want to talk about is no longer on Hudson Avenue. It's now on Wyoming, but you might recognize it. It was originally on Hudson Avenue, and this is the original city hospital. This home actually predates having been a hospital. It was built as a house in the 1830s, again around the same time as the Dr. Cooper house that we just talked about. This home was built by a family with the last name of Jewett. They didn't have anything to do with the Jewett Car Company, if you've ever heard of that. They were here much before that was started. But that was the family that built it. This was originally located on the opposite corner from the last house that we just looked at. This was on the southeast corner of Hudson and Wyoming. This house, like I said, was the original location of the city hospital. I'm not sure exactly what year it was moved, but it was moved back to Wyoming Street where it sits now. And it's actually still there. Here's a picture of it now. So this is one of the really, really important buildings to Newark's history that a lot of people don't really realize what it is. But I'm sure if you've ever noticed it, Wyoming's not a very long street, sort of cut off by 16. And so it's pretty easy to find. It's a really important house. It is, again, vaguely Greek Revival, have some of those details. But if we go back to the Dr. Cooper house, here's a really nice view looking up Hudson. After the Cooper family passed away. Several other families lived there. Eventually, it became home to a Christian Science church. So it's had a lot of different uses over the time, but a lot of people associate this house with something that happened to it, I think around 78 years ago now. If anyone remembers this, so something that happened during World War II was a B-25 bomber crash in Newark. This house, if you look on the left, that's the Dr. Cooper house that we were talking about. You can see there's smoke billowing out of the top. One of the columns is missing, general rubble everywhere. The house on the right is located where the city hospital was originally built. It's on the corner of Wyoming and Hudson. It was actually the house that took the brunt of the impact from the plane. So what damaged the Dr. Cooper house was just some of the explosion from that. There was obviously a lot of fire. So what had happened was in September of 1942, I think they had left Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and they were flying a B-25. I believe they got into some bad weather or something that caused them to get off track, and they ended up crashing. There were several people that were killed. A lady that was in the house. There was a lady who had just been shopping at Carroll's department store, and she was on the sidewalk. She unfortunately was killed. The passengers in the plane, I think there were 2 or 3 men on the plane. So that was a really tragic event that happened in Newark during that time that a lot of people remember. This is the house that took the brunt of the explosion. If you go back to the last picture, you can see in the top there on the right, sort of the damage, and then the bottom picture is pointing to that same corner that was destroyed. So they really kind of took care of it. I was trying to see if I could figure out what corner that was on this house, but the way that some of the bushes are is a little difficult. You can see it's sort of an apartment building or multi-unit house. A lot of people, though, do have memories of this event. I see someone commented that they knew someone whose daughter lived there. I hear stories all the time of people who remember. I talked actually to a family member of someone who was injured. Just lots of really interesting stories that people have memories of that. The next house that we're going to talk about was one of early Newark's grand mansions. This house is no longer standing, but it was sort of legendary in Newark. This home was called Myrtle Hall, and it was built by Israel Dilley, who was an important man in Newark. He was Newark's 11th mayor. He eventually became a county commissioner. Here's a picture of him. Admittedly, it's sort of a blurry picture, but that's the best that I could find. But he was a very important man. He was known, really well known. He was the one who built this house called Myrtle Hall. It was located at the end of Hudson. So when this home existed, Hudson Avenue ended at St. Clair. And beyond that, if you continued on, you would drive onto the property. You can see there's a stream that runs in front of it. That's Log Pond Run. And nowadays, Log Pond Run goes underneath of Hudson. There's a culvert that routes it underneath. So you don't even really realize at the time that you're going over a stream because it just blends in. It's just road right underneath of you. But that's where it was built. This house was built in between Hudson Avenue and Mount Vernon Road. He owned the property between both of those, and it was about 250 feet long. So he had just a little plot of property there. It was sloped really nicely. It was covered with myrtle, apparently, the ground was, so that's where the name came from. Israel Dilley is reported to have brought some plants from England, which is where he had immigrated from, and had planted those and planted other roses and other types of ornamental plants. It made a very park-like setting. After Israel Dilley lived in the house, Henrietta and Louis Evans lived there. They were another really well-known prominent family. Louis Evans in the 1850s had been made, he was the superintendent of the Ohio Canal, so he was a pretty important man. And then he had served as Licking County treasurer for 2 terms, I believe in the 1870s. And he lived in the house. They lived there for several years. Israel Dilly, I believe, passed away in 1860s, 1867 or so, I want to say, or 1870s. And then the Evanses both passed away in the 1890s. Henrietta passed away in 1893, and Lewis passed away in 1897. After they passed away, here actually I have a map. So you can kind of see this yellow line is Locust Street. The blue line is Hudson Avenue. And then that red box is the property where Myrtle Hall was located. So you can see the road just kind of ends. Now, if you go down Hudson, St. Clair is still pretty close to the beginning of it. Hudson extends quite a ways further. But back when Myrtle Hall was built, and for several years, that was the end of Hudson Avenue. So as I said, the Evans family both passed away in the 1890s. After that point, the house was bought, I think, by Dr. Victor Turner, I believe was the person who bought it. And at some point after then, I'm not sure exactly what year, but it wasn't very long after Lewis Evans passed away that the home was actually moved. So it originally sat on the west side of Hudson Avenue, and it was moved over to the east side. So here I have a map, and you can see that road in the middle with the dotted line is Hudson Avenue. You can see the creek running through, that's Log Pond Run. And I put a red square around where the house was moved to. It became a rooming house, or sort of like an apartment type building. You can see on this map, it says Myrtle Hall Hotel. This map is from 1905. But it became essentially apartments for a while afterwards. It was torn down probably, I think, in the 60s or 70s. And this is what was there now. So now you can see there is an apartment building that was there on the site of Myrtle Hall. In its time, it was one of Newark's really best known homes. I want to throw this in because I find it very interesting. This etching is of a house. This is from, I think, the 1866 Atlas. It says residence of A.B. Dumb, Hudson Street, Newark, Ohio. This house is what we refer to as a Downing cottage. And right now we think of Newark having 2 Downing cottages. There's one on Granville Street in front of Newark High School. And then the Penny Mansion out east is also a Downing cottage. And what that means, it refers to a style of home that was inspired by designs by a landscape architect called A.J. Downing. And it became a very popular style of Gothic revival architecture that was built in between the late 1840s up through until the 1870s was kind of the height of it. But here we can clearly see another Downing cottage. This is very similar to the house that's on Granville Street in front of Newark High School. Now this house does still exist on Hudson Avenue. You might not recognize what it is right away, but if I go to the next picture, you can see what it is. Obviously, it's been enclosed with another building. This you can see Rayco Appliance. For a long time, it was Reed's Pharmacy. You can tell on the top, I'll go back to the last picture. You can see that steeple, kind of cupola thing above. If you go around behind, you can see the back of the original building a lot better. You can tell where the chimneys were cut off and that kind of stuff. But there is that house. So we do still have that, and it is what I would call a Downing cottage. I just like to point things out like that. You never know what's hiding around in other buildings. Now I want to show some houses that have been lost due to 16. So there's a variety of really interesting homes that we've lost that sat where Route 16 goes through. So this first house, really pretty house. You can see a lot of people remember going here. It was a photography studio for a long time. I've heard some people say they had their pictures taken there. I like to include this one. This was the home of William Shrewsbury Wright, who was the director of the Jewett Car Company, which manufactured interurban cars and street cars here in Newark for around 20 years. And they were a really important industry to Newark and produced cars that are all over. There are still some in service in San Francisco today. If you stop by the works, we do have a restored Jewett Interurban car that you can get in as well. And this is the house of the man who ran that company. It was, though, torn down to make way for 16. This is a view in front of that house looking south toward downtown, and you can tell just how beautiful of a street it is, tree-lined, just looks really, really peaceful. Another house that was torn down, Dr. O.P. Sook. This was on the corner of Locust and Hudson. Maybe not necessarily lost to 16, but lost nonetheless. Louis P. Schaus house, residence of George Markley. And I'm kind of going through these quick. I don't have a lot of background information about some of these homes, but I like to show the pictures just to kind of get a sense of houses that were there that are no longer there. Not sure if anyone remembers this householder funeral home that was also there as well. And this is a house that was also in the path of what's now 16. It says residence of G. Atherton, and G. Atherton was Gibson Atherton. He was a mayor of Newark. He became a judge on the Ohio Supreme Court. He was a member of U.S. Congress. He was a pretty important figure in Newark and nationally. He's probably more associated with a different house that he built, which is this one. This house was called the Castle. Now, this is not located on Hudson Avenue. This was on the corner of East Church Street and 2nd, now where the parking lot of the hotel is downtown. But this house was inspired by ones that he saw in Washington, D.C. It was built of a really unique kind of purplish colored brick, and it had 4 stories. I think it was Newark's only 4-story house. But the wife, she really didn't like the house. She thought it was inconvenient. I believe the kitchen was in the 1st level and the dining room was in the 2nd level. And she thought that just was really inconvenient. So she didn't really care for the house at all. So she wanted a new house. So then they ended up with this house. Now, this house was known for a pretty interesting feature in that it had some stone lions out the front, or I'm not sure if they were cast or if they were carved out of stone. You can see now this is a pretty blurry picture. Some of these pictures I've had to pull from old books or from the newspaper or something. So I apologize. The quality isn't what I would love for it to be on all these pictures. But anyway, so she had these lions commissioned. She had seen the lions at the New York Public Library, and she wanted some lions of her own here in Newark. So she had commissioned a sculptor to make these lions. However, when she finally got them, she was pretty upset because she had wanted a lion and a lioness. And if you can tell from the picture, these are both 2 lions. So she was, she was not quite as happy with her investment as she had hoped to be. However, these lions became quite a landmark. A lot of kids would climb on them and sit on them. They called them the house with this, they called this house, the house with the stone lions. It became really well known for that. And eventually, like I said, this house was unfortunately, I assume it was torn down for 16. It's possible that some of these homes could have been demolished before then. I don't always, I can't always find all of that information of when these homes were torn down. But after the Athertons lived there, this ended up also being the home of Roe Emerson. If anyone has ever heard of Emerson's store, or if anyone remembers Emerson's store downtown, Roe Emerson lived in this house as well. Moving on, you may or may not remember, Hudson Avenue once had a school. So this, and I just saw a question come across, and I want to let everybody know. So this video it is being recorded, and it will be available later on. So if someone that you know is not able to be here today and watch it live, we are recording this video. So it will be preserved and recorded. We'll be able to post it later on for everyone to enjoy. So don't have to worry about that. If someone's missing out, they will be able to get a chance to see it later on. Obviously, we won't be able to answer questions in the moment. So anyway, this is the old Hudson Avenue School. And this school was located where the parking lot is of the GMP Hall now on Hudson. you can kind of see very faintly at the bottom, it says North 3rd Street School, Newark, Ohio. Again, Hudson Avenue and 3rd Street, very interchangeable terms, mostly called North 3rd Street though in the 19th century. I have heard from stories from people who went to this school. Unfortunately, I don't know the final year of when it actually had students. I think it was torn down sometime in the 1960s, but don't quote me on that because I don't know for sure. If you've ever seen me do one of these presentations in person, you know, generally I'm giving a lot of this information off the top of my head. I try to, if there's dates that I don't know, I try to write them down so that I can give them in the presentation. That's one that I forgot to look up. So don't quote me, but I think it was torn down in the 1960s. Really, really beautiful school though. This was, so back, you know, Newark used to have way more schools than it does now. And they were very indicative of the neighborhoods that they were in. This one you can tell is really beautiful, very elaborate. And this was in one of Newark's wealthier neighborhoods. This was where everyone that ran a business, or maybe not everyone, but a lot of the important businessmen, prominent families, doctors, attorneys lived on Hudson Avenue. And you can tell reflected in the school. Now I want to talk about some of the houses a bit further north on Hudson. This is Hudson at Elizabeth, and I'm sure a lot of us recognize these houses. I kind of like to call these the big three, but there are definitely other large and important houses on Hudson Avenue as well. But you'll notice in the picture from left to right, we have the Swisher Mansion, we have the Fleek Mansion, and we have the Miller Mansion, and we will talk about each of those coming up. First one I want to talk about is the mansion, the Fleek Mansion. This is on the corner of Hudson Avenue and Elizabeth. Some of you guys might be familiar with it, some might not. It was recently for sale, and so I saw a lot of people sharing pictures from the real estate listing. I actually love to pay attention to real estate websites because you see homes like this go for sale quite often, and there's always pictures of the inside. So you always wonder, what does that house look like inside? And a good tip is to pay attention to the real estate websites because you'll get a chance to see what's going on the inside. And this house is really, really beautiful inside. A lot of people don't realize that this house is actually named Ingleside. I'm not sure how long that name stuck around because I only ever saw mention of it once. But it was originally named Ingleside. The cornerstone was laid for this house on August 13th of 1890. And it was built by Henry S. Fleek. He was a pretty important businessman here. He ran a wholesale store, a wholesale grocery store. It was a family-run business, and the business had been an institution in Newark for many years. I think at the time that it closed, it was Newark's oldest, or one of Newark's oldest operating businesses that had been open for 95 years in the 50s when it closed. But Henry S. Fleek was the one who built the house. Here I have a picture of him. A lot of the homes on Hudson Avenue, like I said, were built by businessmen, were built by manufacturers. A lot of these people had diverse business interests, so they didn't just do one thing. They were involved in a lot of different things, much like Henry S. Fleek. Here's a picture of it more recently. You can see this is from one of the real estate listings, actually. It's a really, really kind of cool style. There are some shingle aspects to it, kind of English inspired looking house. Henry Fleek passed away in 1939, but for the almost 50 years that he lived in the house, it was really one of the big centers of Newark social atmosphere. Here I have some pictures of the inside that I took from the real estate listing. So here's an entryway. Oh, that's the Swisher Mansion. So again, one of my favorite houses in Newark, one of the really big ones. One of the other big ones that people always recognize is the Swisher Mansion. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of the inside of it. I wish I did, but I don't. The only ones that I've been able to find were from the newspaper, and so the quality was just pretty difficult to make out what you were looking at. The Swisher Mansion, though, is really interesting. It's got a very interesting story behind it in that it was one of two Swisher mansions in Newark. This was the home of Harry S. Swisher, and this was the home of his brother, John Swisher. A lot of you might remember the John Swisher Mansion. It was a bit further south, still on Hudson, although now it's the part that we just pretty much refer to as 3rd Street. And actually, for the majority of the house's life, it was home to the Elks Lodge. That connected to their large kind of gymnasium auditorium that still is there. This house was torn down in 1992 or 1993. But this house was actually built first. So John Swisher built this home. And if I go back, his brother Harry was so inspired by it that he wanted to build one similar to it. So he built this one. You know, there are slightly different styles, but you can see there's a lot of similarities. Now, the Swisher brothers were important businessmen. They owned Swisher Sweets, Swisher Cigar Company, who became famous for Swisher Sweets. Swisher Cigar Company was founded by their father, David, and eventually the brothers took it over. They did have several other siblings, and one of their other brothers had been a partner with them. And I found something really interesting. Here's some older pictures of the John Swisher Mansion. But just recently I discovered, let's see, we'll get to it. I'm not sure how far ahead this picture is. Anyway, their other brother, E.W. Swisher, built a house that was very similar to theirs. So we'll see it here in a second. Anyway, so this is the John Swisher house. Again, this was torn down in the 90s. Here's a view looking toward downtown from the proximity of that John Swisher Mansion. It's there on the right. So as I said, they own the Swisher Cigar Company. And this is the building that they built. I think this was built around 1893, I want to say. And this was their new factory. As I said, their father had, I think he actually received the company, a cigar company, as some sort of a settlement of a debt, something like that. So he had received it and started to build it and kind of still operate it. But then the sons came in as partners, and then that's when it really started to flourish. So they made a lot of advancements. They designed new technology to be able to manufacture cigars and roll cigars. And as I said, they're famous for coming up with the Swisher Sweets. They also, I think even still to this day, Swisher cigars are the most smoked cigars in the world. Still very, very popular. They're not still made here in Newark anymore. They're made in Jacksonville, Florida. And that's because John Swisher took sole ownership of the company and moved to Florida because he found he could get more land. It was a little bit more favorable of an environment for him, so he moved the company there, which is where it's still located. Now this factory building, you might be looking at that and wondering, is that still around? Can I still find that building? And it is, in fact, it's on West Main Street. It doesn't really look like this though. Again, one of those mysteries. You never know what buildings are hiding underneath of another building or underneath of a facade. So this is, let me see here, go back to my thing. This is the building today. For a long time, it was Arensburg Pharmacy. Now it does have a different name, I think now, and I don't know what the new name is, unfortunately. It's not slipping out of my memory, but this is the same building, believe it or not. Kind of difficult to tell because there is a big brick facade, but this is the Swisher Cigar Factory. Just kind of in between 4th Street and 5th Street on the south side of West Main. Very interesting. So now I think here is the picture of their brother's house, E.W. Swisher's house, and this was located on Gay Street in Columbus. So this one wasn't in Newark. But I have to say that it would have to have been inspired by the other two brothers' homes, because you notice shingles are very much the same. We have sort of a parapet type thing going on that's very decorative, tall chimneys, very, very similar. I'm going to backtrack here. I don't want to make anybody car sick, but if you go look at that picture and then go back, they're just very similar. So I have to think that they had some sort of inspiration. I think E.W. Swisher was bought out by John and Harry pretty early on in the 1880s or 1890s, but he was originally involved with them. So the brothers kind of they were at odds with each other because one built a house copying the other. Harry copied or is said to have copied his brother John's style. But as we know, Harry's the one that got the last laugh because his house is the only one that's still standing. Harry Swisher died, I think in 1929, I want to say. And then his brother had moved to Florida and is buried there in Florida. Here's another prominent house. This is the other one of the big three, as I said. This is the home of William C. Miller and his family. This is located on the northwest corner of Hudson and Elizabeth. So you can see this is a pretty large, sort of Tudor-ish kind of style home. It was designed by Frank Packard, who was a prominent architect. Frank Packard designed the renovations at the Brindley Mansion. He did a lot of buildings around Ohio, not just Newark. Here's a picture of the home today. It kind of faces Elizabeth, more or less. So this was the home of William C. Miller. He was a store owner. Originally, he had a store that sold china and furniture and that kind of stuff, and that got bought out and incorporated into the Powers Miller department store. Powers Miller was responsible for building the Union Block on West Church Street, which is where 31 West is now. They built that in 1903. And then they eventually, really not that long afterward, 10 or 15 years later, moved to the Hall building, which was where King's Department Store was for many years, if anyone remembers that. That's actually now, well, not anymore, but most recently Chase Bank was in there. It's the tall building on the square. But anyway, William C. Miller built this house and lived in it. I think this home was built around 1902, I believe. And interestingly, his wife, Alice Fleek Miller, was the sister of Henry Sherwood Fleek, who lived in the Fleek Mansion just across the street from them. So I think it's pretty interesting. They lived right beside each other, essentially. Alice Fleek Miller and William C. Miller were the parents of Gay Reese, who married Everett Reese, whose son was Gib Reese, if any of those names are familiar, just to kind of place some of these families. They are still around, still families that are here in Newark. This next house is just kind of referred to as the Worley Mansion, and sometimes people say the Worley Mansion, and then you have to ask the question, well, what Worley Mansion? There are houses scattered all over Licking County that are called the Worley Mansion, and you know, that's for many reasons. Sometimes the families bought a different house and moved, but there are also several Worleys, and they all needed places to live. This house is, I think the address is 444 Hudson Avenue, and it was actually built as a development. It was built by Warren Wyant, and he purchased a lot of land. I mentioned, you know, Hudson Avenue used to end at Myrtle Hall. It ended at St. Clair. And then as it was expanded into a lot of just empty land. So Warren Wyant bought lots and he started to just build houses. So nowadays we think of housing developments as homes that all look the same. He just knew that if he built these homes, people would buy them. And then that's what they did. So this was one of those houses that was built by Warren Wyant. And it was later purchased by William Worley. He was the son of Joseph Worley, who founded the Worley Stove Factory. After Joseph's death, William did become the president of the Worley Stove Company. And this was the house where he lived in until his death. He did die in this house. Here I have a picture of William Worley. This is him younger, in his younger years. He passed away in 1938. The house was built, I think, around 1890. I do love this picture, though, because you can see the bus. That's out front. That is a bus. Not anything like the ones we have now, but very quaint. Here's a picture of it more recently. Again, this house was on the market not that long ago, so it was another opportunity to see inside some of these homes. This house is just absolutely beautiful. Here's a picture from the inside. I love to show off these inside pictures because we get a chance to see in some of these houses that we don't normally get to. So again, just a very extravagant house. If you're not familiar, the Worley Stove Factory was one of Newark's biggest industrial operations. It was at one time the world's largest manufacturer of stoves. A lot of people don't realize it was also the world's largest manufacturer of lawnmowers at one point in time. They did manufacture more than just stoves. It had switched hands through the years. After the Worley Stove Factory became the Florence Worley, then it became Newark Stove. Eventually it was purchased by Sears and Roebuck, and they made Kenmore appliances. And they made Roper appliances. So it went through several phases. But William Worley was the man that lived in this house. And I believe actually after he passed away, his widow was the one, then she purchased a house on Marne Road that a lot of people think of as the Worley Mansion. That house is kind of known as Montour's Point, and I believe it was actually originally built by the Montgomery family. But I think she actually moved there, and then they had greenhouses and stuff out there. Well, not the big Wyant greenhouses, that was next door. This house is connected to the Heisey family. This was the home of Edgar Wilson Heisey. He was the son of Augustus H. Heisey, who founded the Heisey Company. After Augustus's death, Wilson took over, and he did run the Heisey Company as well. Oh, this was their house. This house was also for sale not that long ago, and so there were some pictures of the inside. Unfortunately, I didn't have the foresight to save any of those. So we get a picture of the outside. I really like the style of this house. It's pretty indicative of kind of the late, there was a lot of Tudor revival going on in that time around the turn of the century. So I think it's really cool. I've heard some pretty interesting stories from people who remember Wilson Heisey's widow, that she liked to keep, she had a lot of antiques apparently in this house. And I remember someone telling me a story that they went in as a child and they found it to be very scary because they thought it was so dark and there were all these old antiques around, and she was at this point an elderly woman. So it was sort of an interesting memory to hear. But this house is one of the Heisey mansions. We have several, connected to the Heisey family around Newark, but that's who lived in this one. This next house, I mentioned Frank Packard, who designed the Miller House. This is the house of John J. Carroll. I guess I can't guarantee, but most of us have probably heard of Carroll's department store. Oh, Wally said they found glass recipes and a ton of glassware in the attic in the Heisey house. So that's pretty cool. That's a really interesting thing. Wilson Heisey passed away in 1942. I forgot to mention that. But anyway, so on to the Packard House, home of John J. Carroll. This one is located just a little bit north of the Miller House. It's on the west side of Hudson. This is a floor plan of the first floor. So you can see it's not one of, there are definitely larger houses on Hudson Avenue, but the style of it is, again, really in keeping with some of those others. Here's a picture of it today, or not today, it was several years ago. You can see there was a for sale sign, but this was whatever was on Google Street View. I have to take a lot of these current pictures from there. Again, a really interesting house. This is another Frank Packard house. We're up to Frank Packard house number 3 in this area. And this is the home of Clarence White. I wanted to include this because we have a really exciting show coming up in July that will open at the gallery at the Works, featuring works from Clarence White and the Newark Camera Club. Clarence was a really visionary photographer he wasn't born in Newark, but he lived in Newark in young adulthood and as an adult, and was married here, started to develop a passion for photography. He had seen a photography exhibit at the World's Fair in Chicago and wanted to try his hand at photography. So he started saving up his money to buy glass plates, got into the photography industry, and revolutionized photography. He started the photo secessionist movement, and the Newark Camera Club kind of made Newark the epicenter of photography as an art form in America, which is unknown to a lot of people that live here, and it's really incredible part of our history. But this was a house that was designed by Frank Packard to be his home and his studio. Here are some elevations. You can see some drawings of the front, and we have some floor plans here. I really love how it mentions you can see where the studio was, and it's just nestled right in with the other rooms. Very interesting. And then here's a photo of it from back in the day. You can see it's actually right next to the home of Wilson Heisey that we just talked about. You can see it there. And again, these houses are all sort of in that same cluster sort of area all around the intersection of Hudson and Elizabeth in the 400s block of Hudson. And really the house doesn't look like it's changed too much over the years. Other than some trees growing up in front of it, it looks pretty much the same. This is a view of a postcard that I found showing when a lot of these houses were built. These houses were new. So it's a little bit difficult to figure out where this is, but you see 3 houses kind of in the foreground, and then what looks like a white colored house. In between the 3rd house and that white house is Cecil Street. So there's an intersection there. And these houses do still stand. They're right there. Some of them have changed a little bit, but not all that much. I think actually the one here on the right is also for sale, and it's really cool inside. There's a lot of really cool stuff. Again, I took that opportunity to find pictures of what was going on the inside. But this neighborhood has changed and evolved over the years, and a lot of things have been added, but there's a lot of the character that's still intact. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information about these 3 homes, other than the fact that they would have been built probably in the 1890s, in that general time of when a lot of this was being developed. Again, they probably could have been houses that were built sort of to be developed, but or they could have been built by individual builders. I don't necessarily know that answer, but I just like to show, going back, everything was new and the trees were little and looked different, but yet pretty similar. So that is the end of my presentation. I do encourage anyone to ask questions. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video back on, just that way you can see me. Again, I didn't want to have my video on to distract from the presentation. If anybody missed an explanation to something, if you have a question about something that I didn't talk about, if you have something to share about one of the houses, I do encourage you to use that chat box. If you're not sure where that is, it should be at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a device like an iPhone or iPad or something, then you might have to kind of look at some of your options. I'm not sure if it's located in the same place everywhere. But go ahead. It looks like maybe someone has their hand up. Vel's iPad, I'm not sure who that is, but I'm going to unmute you. Vel, if you have a question, do you want to go ahead and speak up? Actually, I don't know if I can unmute you.
I don't have a question.
Oh, okay.
I was about to send a comment about how beautiful the carriage houses are.
Yeah, so I actually love that you brought that point up, because a lot of these houses have carriage houses and barns, and people had horses, and so there were barns, literal barns, and what now we use carriage house is kind of a nicer way than just saying barn, but that's essentially what they were. And so a lot of these houses have them, and I love to drive around and look behind houses when I'm driving through Newark, just to kind of see what's back there. The garage, now it's been used as a garage, or sometimes people turn them into a guest house, but you can really tell, a lot of times they were built for horses. So yeah, some of those, especially that one on the corner of Elizabeth and Hudson, has an amazing guest house. So thank you for that comment. If anybody else has any questions, looks like, someone says they have blueprints. That's very cool. Go ahead and ask any of your questions if you want to. I should be able to see if you type it in. Let me look through. See, I'm just looking to see if anybody had asked any questions that I didn't get to at the time. Again, just a reminder for everyone, if you missed the beginning of the presentation, or if you didn't see something, or if you just weren't paying attention, or someone else that you didn't get a chance to join, this is being recorded, so we will be able to post it later on. I believe we'll probably post it to our social media outlets, so you'll be able to see it on those. You can always reach out to us by email or phone. Also, I did put my contact information on the screen. So that way, if you ever have any questions, I love to kind of help answer questions. Sometimes I have the time to be able to do a little bit more research for people. Sometimes I don't. We do get pretty busy with programming at the museum. But if I have time, I'm always willing to try to help you out to at least answer some questions. So you can always give me a phone call. My direct number there is 740-670-8066, or you can email me, corystutes@theworks.org. Someone asked if I know where the lions ended up. Unfortunately, I don't know where the lions ended up. I would love to know that. I think it would be really cool to see those lions. I have no idea if they survived. If they did survive, I don't know where they would be. Someone else asked, is there any old video from the 40s? Is there a video about anything specific that you're interested in? We do have some videos. We have some kiosks in the museum, and then some that we have additional videos. We have some videos of some like farmland. There is in like a farm family. There's also, there are videos that were taken of Newark in, I don't know if they're from the 1940s or the 1950s, but there are some videos out there. I know the library has some copies, the Historical Society has copies, and if you search around online, you might be able to find them. They do have downtown Newark, so I can't remember if there's any of Hudson Avenue, of the street, but I know that they are downtown on the square. Shows scenes of Newark. Like I said, I don't know if they're 1940s, but it might be 1950s. One of them is called, it's like Our Hometown Newark or something. So you can check, if you call the Historical Society, whenever the library opens up, you can check in there as well, and they can help you out with that. Because I know that both of those places do have copies of those. If you wanted to see them, like I said, they might be online as well. If you search on YouTube, you might be able to find some of that information on there as well. Let's see, yeah, someone says that they live on Hudson Avenue, and their house was built by the vice president of a lumber company with different wood in every room. I love those kind of details. A lot of times you can actually find information like that that's been recorded, whether it's in the newspapers, sometimes books and things like that will have it, where they mention details like that, where they talk about the woodwork in a room. They talk about these details. You know, people, a lot of time people built their homes, they designed their homes themselves, and they built their own homes. There weren't necessarily things like buying building plans. You didn't really have building permits always. You didn't have a lot of the things that we do now. So people were, and people couldn't afford to employ a lot of people to do that for them. So they would take things into their own hands. So you get a lot of really creative details in some of these older houses that really reflect the people that built them. Now, if we're talking about the Swisher Mansion, the Fleek Mansion, those types of things, those men didn't build the homes themselves. They absolutely employed people to do it. But you still see reflections of the industries that they were involved in. I know the Swisher Mansion, there are S's carved into a lot of the woodwork. You see really elaborate details, and a lot of times you see things that reflect the business that they were in. So those kinds of details I absolutely love, and I would recommend you know, that you keep track of that, and you make a copy for yourself, but make a copy that stays with the house as well, because those are the types of details that help people fall in love with the homes later in the future. So I really encourage people to be their own detectives of their house. House history is something that I'm really interested in. I've given a lot of presentations. You might have seen some of my presentations when I was at the library about that topic. So it's something I'm really interested in and very passionate about. So like I said, please, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to give you pointers. I'll be happy to point you in the right direction if you're trying to find resources, answer any questions if I can. I do want to give just a little bit more time if anybody has any questions that you want to ask. Go right ahead. Feel free to type it in the chat box. You can also raise your hand if you want. It should show me if you raise your hand. And I also, you know, I just want to thank everybody who took part in this. This is a new thing for us to do a presentation like this on Zoom. And so it's new territory, but I think it's really exciting. It's pretty convenient for us all to be able to join from the comfort of our own home and join in something like this. So if this is something that you like, please let us know. And, we really would appreciate the feedback on that. And just, if this format worked out for you, keep your eye out for new things. We're trying to post a lot of new programming on our social media outlets and through email. There's a lot of exciting stuff coming up through the summer. We'll continue to have side-home experiences. We also have been working on some other things for kids and families. So please keep your eyes peeled on that. Lots of works at home opportunities, just like this one, and all types of varieties. So does anybody else have any last questions? Absolutely love hometown. Yeah, it definitely, this is why I love history, because it inspires people to fall in love with where they live. And I'm not from Newark. I didn't grow up here. I've been here almost for 10 years now. But I absolutely love learning about the history of the town, and it just makes you feel so much more connected. Local history is so important to me. Local history is world history, but it's attainable to us. The same things were happening. We can see those reflections of other world events happening here in Newark, but they're happening in places that we go to every day, and in houses that we live in, and to people that, we could be related to. So yeah, I think it's a great place to live, and it's got a really cool history. All right, well, if no one else has any other questions, then I think that does bring our presentation to an end. Thank you all again for joining. I really appreciate it. Hopefully you guys will keep in touch. Let us know your thoughts. Follow us on social media and see what will be coming up next. And everyone enjoy your evening.